I'm very happy to welcome all of you today. My name is Prisa. I'm a professor of international management in Tokyo. I'm very sorry for my voice. I'm currently in Europe and the temperature dropped quite a lot in the last 2 days. We have 15 degrees today and it's really cold. And I got a really strong cold, so my voice is not really what it should be. And I hope you forgive me for that. But still, I'm very happy to have you here today. So what I'm going to do today is give you a short introduction on Japanese business culture. This is what I do for a job. I'm a professor of international management at Sophia University in Tokyo. Originally, I'm from Austria, and I've been working and living in Japan for very many years. And my research focus is Japanese business culture or Japanese culture and how it influences Japanese business processes. And I do a lot of trainings and consulting for foreign companies in Japan. And one of my jobs is to introduce Japanese business cultures to investors and to startups in Japan. So my plan for today is to give you a short overview on what the Japanese company is about. I've been doing this for really very many years, and I've been researching Japanese companies for over 20 years, and people keep telling me Japanese companies are changing, which is very true. But at the same time, Japanese companies have very basic structures and a very basic culture, and to understand it makes it a lot easier for everybody to do business with Japan. There's a few things I would like to say. I have actually uploaded all the materials you need on the Google Drive. You can see in the chat. Tom will share it again. And there's also one of my latest books available as a present for you. It's called Japanese Business Concepts You Should Know. And it's like a dictionary really, but it explains the most relevant business aspects of Japan on a one-page level, and it's quite it's basically a very good book to read if you're interested in doing business in Japan and getting the background information that I cannot share with you today. I have 90 minutes today. We will go through a number of aspects of doing business with Japan. I've also prepared 2 case studies that you can also download from this drive, and we hopefully have enough time to look at them. So let's start. I would like to really go into different major concepts that you need to know. And here we are not only talking about big companies in Japan. Most smaller companies in Japan have very similar structures. And one thing that I need to say is that even if you are in Asia or not so far away from Japan, business structures in Japan are really quite different. And even if you have a certain, let's say, similarity in the idea of doing business, it's always important to know what the background of these business concepts are, and that's what I'm trying to explain to you today. So the first concept that I would talk about is the so-called concept of ie. Ie is the Japanese word for house or household, and what it really describes is some kind of group that behaves, in fact, like a family without being a family, which is a very important difference to companies in other countries. What does it mean? You can imagine the concept like a samurai household in the old times. Samurai households were very big households. There were people, of course, living there, family members, fathers, mothers, children, grandchildren. But they were also having a lot of people working around this place, and this became a household. So basically everyone felt very connected to this place and became a member of this place. So everyone who was in this household or in this little company, maybe we can call it too, was treated or behaved like a family member without being a family member. And this is a really important fact because most Asian countries prefer family members or people they're strongly related with to do business with. In Japan, we have actually a very unique version. We have a group that is not family, but behaves like family. And I think this is a very good and important thing to remember because people you will meet in Japan who work for a company feel very dedicated to this company. They have very many, they usually spend very many years in the same companies. They behave like family members, and they do not often never change companies. So there's a very strong emotional relation to these organizations. And in fact, this is also a very important reason to understand why Japanese companies are so big, because they could pretty much integrate everybody when they went overseas, when Japanese companies started to internationalized in the 1960s, 70s, they could really hire a lot of people who are not related to, which is a big difference to other Asian companies, for example, Middle Eastern firms. On top of that, this is also the reason why Japanese companies are so old, because they could actually adopt people into the family very easily. Usually it's young men. And in Japan today, still more grown-up people are adopted than children. And this is the reason why companies can go on over hundreds of years. The oldest Japanese company is more than 1,000 years old. And of course, this helps the company to stay a unit. Yeah. And for Japanese companies, stability and kind of being able to survive as a company is the most important thing. So stability is a very major factor. So what does this mean for people? The companies are, of course, also based on this concept. We have a very strong emotional connection between people who work in the firm and the company. The company is very absorbing, yeah. So people have actually live for the company. They have a really strong relationship to the company, maybe a stronger relationship than with their own families. And in Japanese, this is called marugakai. Marugakai means that you are actually absorbed by the whole thing. And this is one reason why Japanese people work so hard, work so long, and find it really very difficult to detach. Another reason and another effect of this concept is also that people do not change jobs. So people stay in the same company for very many years. They do not stay in the same jobs, but they stay in the same firm. So what does this mean for a foreign investor or for a startup working in Japan? I mean, the most important thing for you here is the question, how does this affect you, or how does this affect your firm? So one thing is really important to remember. Japanese companies are always in for a long-term relationship. So one time a Japanese manager in one of my trainings said the best way to find out if a company is still there after 3 years is to wait for 3 years. And this is a really important aspect. So when doing business with Japanese firms, it's always important to make sure that you communicate, we want to do this for a long term. We are interested in a long and lasting relationship. So these relationships are based on trust. Yeah, Japanese companies usually do not have a very clear internal structure apart from seniority. I'll talk about this a bit later. But you need to have a very trustful relationship. And of course, a trustful relationship needs time. So you need to build up trust by working with each other. And that's, of course, also something that you have to be a bit more patient about. Yeah, this is the next thing. It takes time to find a Japanese business partner. As I said, you want to be integrated. You want to have a strong relationship, a family-like relationship in the long run. And finding the right partners is not so easy. And of course, from a Japanese point of view, it's really risky to do business with people you don't know. And it's also risky to do business with a small firm. So you need to have, you need to invest this time also into personal relationships with the businesses. The good thing is, and that's why people actually do business with Japan, even though it may take a lot longer than in other Asian countries, once a relationship is established, people will actually stay with you. So there's a very long and strong relationship with people who are Japanese companies are doing business with, and this is actually very reliable. So that's basically the goal of most investors in Japan. Finally, as I just said, Japanese companies are taking a really big risk to do business with foreign partners, and they basically need to make sure this is a reliable connection and a long-lasting connection. And this is also very important for the person you work with, or the person, for example, introduces you, because this person is then fully responsible for your behavior. And so there's a lot of basically fear of the relationship being broken or the relationship not working really well. And this kind of fear is actually a bigger problem than many other things. And as a foreigner or a foreign company coming to Japan, one of the biggest jobs is to make sure that people feel relaxed with you and they are thinking of working with you for a long time, and you have to build this connection. Here are some examples. There's a company from Singapore, SWAT Mobility, who entered the market. They have a very specialized route optimization technology. One problem in Japan is, and this is one of the biggest business opportunities, is the shrinking population. So there is not enough people buying things and there's not enough people using, let's say, transport. And this company helps transport companies um, to improve the basically the numbers of people, or basically be more efficient when taking people around. And it started with a Japanese partner in a smaller place called Niigata, which is actually not one of the major cities, but basically had a really strong local partner. And this was very important to get the business going, even though the partner is not one of the biggest firms, but the interaction with the partner actually allowed to enter the market and start from there. So the next concept I would like to talk about, excuse me, is the concept of Uchisoto. Uchi means inside and Soto means outside. And that's, of course, the same everywhere. You have members and you have non-members. But in Japan, this is particularly important. So in Japan, if you are a member of a big organization, it's always better than being a member of a small organization or being a member of no organization. And that's actually a very important factor. In Japan, people always know where you belong to. Yeah, and this is a very important thing to communicate. Here we can see a picture. Japanese companies have a really strong boundary. You can see that here. People enter and people are supposed to stay. Whereas Western organizations or even organizations in Asian countries have usually a strong fluctuation. People have a very emotional, basically a very self-centered idea about careers. They go to different firms if it's a good idea, if they get more money, if they get better positions, and they come back. So changing companies is not a big problem. Whereas in Japan, you're supposed to stay in one firm. So don't be surprised if you meet people in Japan who have never had another job. I know people in Japan who've been 40, 50 years in the same firm, and they're very proud of it. And of course, the question is, what do people do in these companies? One very important factor is that companies in Japan are allowed to basically do anything in the firm. A Japanese contract in general is a contract in which you are simply getting into the company, and then the company will decide what you do. So this is a very important factor for foreign companies and leads to a lot of confusion. Yeah. Because what happens in the company is that people enter the firm and then the company decides what they do. So people are not hired for a particular job. Yeah. So I can give you an example. When I was hired for my current job, I'm a professor. My contract basically is one line, and it says as a professor from April 1st, 2006. And it never describes what I do, where I work, how much money I get, nothing. And in the end, you know, the problem with this is that when you do business with Japanese companies, one person that you will talk to may be exchanged and go to a different department anytime, and you will have to talk to somebody else. This is actually a very major issue. So what happens in a Japanese company, we can rotate people all over the place anytime. Yeah, people are chosen depending on the company need, and they're not staying in one job with one expertise. So by the time people have actually been in a company for 20 years, they have been in every department. Usually they change and rotate every 2 years. And the company is completely free to tell people what to do. So the company can say on Friday afternoon, from now, for Monday on, you work in New York for 2 years, or we'll send you to the countryside for 2 years, and people will do it. Yeah. So this is very important. On the one hand, people in the Japanese companies like that really very much. You wouldn't believe it. But I have done a lot of MBA teaching in Japan with Japanese managers, and they really, really think this is a very good system. But it is rather confusing for people who are not working in Japan, because it means that you can talk, or you often talk to very different people on the same topic, which is not always really beneficial for bigger projects. So what does this mean for you? Basically, it means that internal relationships are more important than other relationships. So people in the company will always have more to say about things than outsiders, and it's not always about being logical in decision making. So that's another really important factor. Companies that are related to the firm or belong to the same companies, they are having more power, so they are more trusted. So, and this means, on the other hand, if you do business with one company in a big conglomerate, everyone else will do business with you too. So that's good and bad at the same time. And getting one partner in a big company in a very famous group is really very beneficial. And that's the reason, sorry. That's the reason why many Japanese startups are connected to big Japanese conglomerates, because that allows them to enter the market a lot quicker and faster. And you need to find a business partner who has good connections with these companies. Basically, if you have a good product and you have a good technology, this is not so difficult, because Japanese companies are very good in integrating newer and smaller firms. But this is a very classic way of entering the Japanese market, that you basically team up with a big Japanese company and take all the benefits from that. Yeah, but one thing is very important too. You may talk to a manager and you have a good relation, and you've been actually building up something with these people, and then from one day to the next, there's completely new people talking to you who have no experience in the topic, no experience in the field, and that can actually happen quite frequently, because the Japanese company, as I said before, is rotating people constantly and doesn't care so much about their prior experience, and that can be quite problematic for a project in some cases. So here we see it. People who are you are dealing with may not have any knowledge in the field, because they're just assigned to you, and they may go somewhere else quickly. So that's really one aspect where foreign investors are strongly influenced by this. So, okay. Wait a minute. Here we go. So here's another example of a
Professor, we cannot hear you because you just mute your mic.
now?
Yeah,
Is it
we
okay
can hear
now?
you now.
Sorry,
Yeah,
sorry.
it's okay
Thank
now.
you. Thank you. I'm sorry.
We
Yeah.
lost you for about 30 seconds. Thank you.
Okay, so here's an example of a company that is called Lipotype. It actually is a company that was founded out of one of the big German biotechnology think tanks, and it entered the Japanese market because it wanted to be, let's say, a global player right from the start. And they had a partner in Japan. There were some difficulties with the partner in the beginning, and once they basically dealt with these difficulties, they had some intervention with different partners that helped them establish a strong relationship. Business actually went really successful very quickly. So this is one of the most popular or most famous examples of market entry of German firms in Japan. So, so I cannot move the slide. Here we go. Sorry, that was a mistake. So the next topic that I would like to talk about is the structure inside the firm. And there's a very famous word for it called Tate Shakai. Tate Shakai means vertical society. And you may have heard, and that may be similar in other Asian countries, that older people have more power than younger people. In some Asian countries, the real age plays a very important role. In Japan, the age in the company is often more important, which means that somebody who's been in a company longer than you has more to say. Yeah, this is not really a very unique concept, but it also relates to all kinds of other aspects. Here we have an example of an American company that entered the Japanese market. And here we can see a relationship to all the concept I already talked about. They entered the market, they had a really strong product, and then they connected or were bought by Honda. And Honda is a company that has, of course, a lot of market power, has a lot of, let's say, relationships in Japan. And because of these relationships, the company was thriving very quickly. And this connection with Japanese conglomerates is actually a really very, very good way to go. Seniority in Japan plays always a very important role. You can see this here, especially when you communicate. There are more concepts in Japanese language than in other languages. one is called honne. Honne means that's my private opinion, what I really think, and tatemae is my public opinion. And as you can see, and that may be similar in other Asian countries, it is really difficult to say no or disagree with somebody older. That's actually one of a very big issue in Japan, yeah, and one aspect that many Japanese companies deal with. They have actually for a while started not to hire too many older people or hire them back after retirement, and this has changed again in the past years simply because there isn't enough workers in Japan, which is one major issue why this topic becomes a bit of a debate. Yeah, so older people have more power in any case, and that's of course also one thing that affects business meetings. One very important way, or very easy way to find out who is the oldest or who is the person with the highest power is looking at seating arrangements. Seating arrangements in Japan are really very structured, so you can really tell where you sit. I can give you one example. I started to work at my current company, I think 16 years ago, and I started here. The lowest level person always sits next to the door, the youngest person too. And after 16 years, I moved up 2 chairs, which is the right direction, because the highest level people or the highest ranked people always sit next to the window. So if you have a Japanese business meeting and you need to know who is the real person who has the power or you should talk to, it's usually the person who sits most far away from the door. And this is actually really important, which also means that if you have a business meeting in Japan, it's advisable not to just sit down anywhere because that bit can be seen as rather rude. Here you can see it again. We have the so-called kamisa. Kamisa is the highest seat, which is most far away from the door, usually next to a window, and the shimosa. Shimosa is closest to the door, which is actually meaning this is where the youngest people sit, the people who coordinate, and sometimes also the people who speak the best English. Yeah, that can be a bit confusing. So these are the people who actually are waiting to move up here. Yeah, it might take about 20, 30 years to come up to the seat. But this is the easiest way to understand who you're dealing with and who you should actually talk with. Here's some more examples. This is really important. The internet is full of descriptions with this. Here we have a room with 2 doors, which makes it a bit more complicated. The highest ranked person sits here. Here we have a Japanese room. The highest ranked person sits here. Here's some more arrangements. And we can also see this if we go to a Japanese office, yeah. So if we enter the office here, we can see that here are all the managers. This is the highest ranked manager, who is called Bucho. Bucho is responsible for the whole department. And here are the staff members, different levels. But this is always the sign that this person has the highest rank. Yeah, so this is very important because sometimes in Japan it's not quite clear who really is in charge, because it is a very group-oriented way of making decisions. But then again, that's one of the easiest things to do. So what does this mean for you? We have vertical structures dominating Japanese business everywhere, yeah, so they cannot be ignored. And it might be very possible that you're talking to somebody who is younger and who speaks fluent English and is an engineer or an expert in a field, but is not allowed to make any decisions because high-ranked people who have less experience in the field maybe are still dominating the whole discussion. So that's one issue. So don't be surprised about that. And really, it's important to try to get in contact with the person who has the most power. And that, as I said, is most easily found out by seating arrangements. Yeah, if you speak Japanese well, you can also find out by. Okay, is that question? Sorry, is that question? Okay.
Hi person, wait a second。我们现场来宾，请你们记得把你们的麦克风给关掉，因为你们已经干扰到国际远在海外的演讲者。谢谢。
Okay, is that question?
Apology for that. No.
No, it's okay. Okay.
I should ask everybody to turn off their mic if they're
Oh,
not
sorry.
asking.
Sorry. If there's a question, just shout.
Apology for that.
Okay.
I'll mute.
No worries. Since I don't speak Chinese, I don't know if it's a question or not. That's it. So what is important? It's important to really understand that, oh, age dominates in Japan, whatever people say. And this is good and bad at the same time. So it is important to find out who is the highest ranked person. It is also important to make sure that if you're talking to somebody, and often this is the case, the youngest person or younger people speak better English, but they have very little power to identify who is actually in charge or who can actually make a decision, which is often a group decision anyway, but still. So, as I said before, the person you communicate and negotiate with has little individual power. So every decision in Japan is, or most decisions are made by groups. So if you talk to one person, if you have a communication with one manager in the field, this person will not be able to make a decision in most cases, unless this person is the owner of the firm. Yeah. So in Japan, owned firms are a bit different, but in general, especially if it's a bigger company, you will probably not talk to any owners. So if you talk to a person, if you have a one-to-one meeting with this person, it's very possible that this person cannot make a decision. So this means any meeting or a lot of meetings are information meetings, and you just get information or give information, and then this person will go back to the group and ask or tell the group what's going on and come back with a decision later. This is also the case when you write emails. Yeah, that's a very big issue when foreign companies start doing business with Japan. You write an email to a person, this person has the same job description as you, for example, project manager, and you assume that this person can actually make decisions as you can as a project manager, but this person is basically just communicating with you and still has to go back to the group, ask everybody, and then write back. This can take up to 2 days. Yeah, so this is actually a really big issue. And I have done so many trainings in Japan for foreign companies, really, and this is one of the biggest problems, that companies outside Japan do not understand why things often take so long in Japan and why they talk to somebody who cannot make any decisions. But in general, we can say that decisions are group decisions, and the person you talk to is mainly a communicator, not a decision maker. So this is a very important thing to keep in mind, because that creates usually a lot of conflict. Yeah. So as we said here, all the managers have more power, and it has nothing to do with job description or with knowledge. Yeah, so that can be rather problematic too, because older managers always have to be listened to, but they may not be in the field, and they may not have up-to-date ideas or experiences or knowledge in the field too. So this is actually a really big issue, but cannot be really avoided. And as I said, all communication is shared with older or other members of the group. You will hardly find a communicator who can make decisions. I had one case a few years ago, sorry, a German company entering the Japanese market. And when they did that, they had a Japanese partner. It worked really well. And the only person they communicated with was a young man who just entered the company a year ago, and he was fully bilingual, so he could speak English and Japanese fluently, and they always sent every email to him. And they, of course, thought that he was in charge, but he was just basically communicating because he was the youngest and he was the only one who could actually speak English really well. And in the end, what he did, this young man constantly put the whole group members on CC, so every conversation with the foreigners was shared, and the foreigner thought that he was escalating it or there was a problem, and they felt really upset about that. And in the end, it turned out that he was just sharing all the communication to make sure that everyone knows, because he was not the one in charge. He was just talking to them. So this is very important to remember. The person you communicate with, even if this person has the same job title as you have, this person may not be able to make the same decisions as you are. And that's why it usually often takes 1 or 2 days to get answers from these people. So, as I said before, meeting with Japanese people or Japanese managers are often only information meetings. That's another big issue. Usually foreign companies come to Japan, they have a few days, they have 5 meetings lined up, and they expect to come home with results. Yeah, this is not always possible in Japan because, as I said before, you need to build up trust, you need to get to know each other. So you have to get a lot of information and make sure that you're not making a mistake when doing business with a foreign company. So this means that many meetings are simply information sharing meetings, yeah. And again and again and again, I usually have up to 5 or 4 meetings with a client before they hire me as a consultant. And it needs this time, yeah. So the company has to make sure that you're a good partner. They have to get all the information they need. They have to communicate it back to the rest of the company or to their team. And this is the reason why many meetings in Japan are not meetings where you come to a result or you basically renegotiate and come up with a deal or something like that. So this is one thing you need to know and you need to kind of calculate with, because it may take 2 or 3 more meetings to do business in Japan than in other countries. Yeah, and that's also a very common misunderstanding. So, okay. As I said before, the most powerful person usually sits next to the windows or very close to the windows, and you will see that Japanese always do that. Yeah, this is a bit often not so visible for us foreigners because we don't care so much about sitting arrangements. And it doesn't have any say or any meaning for us. But in Japan, this plays a really important role. For example, I have a lot of foreign students and international Japanese students in my school. This doesn't mean much anything at all, but we used to do projects with other Japanese universities, and they have also the sitting arrangement in the classrooms. Yeah, the older students sit in the front, then the third year students after that, and the younger students sit in the back of the classroom. So you can always see who is in which position, and that actually makes a really important difference for Japanese people. I would like to do a short case, basically showing the relevance of dealing with Japanese customers. And I will actually try to go back and show you this thing now. Hang on. So let me try to show you the case that I would like to have a look at. Sorry, this was not the right one. There we go. And can you see this one? I think it's readable. So this is a case study that is a typical case study. And I have actually really collected a lot of stories over the past years of foreigners doing business with Japan. And this is the case that always comes up in every single communication. And I kind of made a story out of this with a German company. So maybe you can have a short look at that and then write some answers in the chat. Yeah, the questions are here. So basically, we can actually talk about foreign or European foreign companies, but it doesn't really matter. I would like to write the question here in the chat. So here you can see it, and I will show you this again. So here are here's the the case. The case deals with the idea of what customers are like and how customers should be treated. Yeah. Maybe you can have a short look at this case and then we discuss it together. So. Maybe 2 more minutes and then. Okay. So I hope this works. Okay. Good. So one aspect that Japanese companies have a really serious issue with is the idea about how to be customers. And as I said before, it is a very vertical society that we're dealing with, and customers are, of course, on top of everything. Yeah. So customers are always more important than non-customers. That's not really a surprise. But what it means here is that you really have to abide by the rules of the customers, even though it kind of contradicts what you're believing in. So basically, the question would be, what can you do to deal with that? Or what would be a good idea to communicate if you're very customer-oriented in Japan? Maybe there is some answers. David wrote something already. Yeah. Yeah, the risk for the company is really high. And of course, for the Japanese company to lose face in front of a Japanese customer is a really big problem. So they're very concerned about that. But maybe you can write some answers in the chat if you have any suggestions on how this can be dealt with. How you can actually communicate a strong indication of, okay, how you can actually communicate how we can improve the relationship with that. Ideas? I'm sorry. My voice is not too good today. Yeah, it takes time. Very good. Yeah. And that's very true. Maybe some more answers here, if possible. Okay. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I would like to add here is that there are customers and there are customers in Japan. And of course, there are some customers in Japan that are really extremely important. One thing that I will not have enough time to discuss here are the so-called keiretsu. Keiretsu are big Japanese conglomerates that are dominating the Japanese market. They're very famous ones like Sumitomo, Mitsubishi, Mitsui, all the big manufacturers. Toyota, for example, also have their own keiretsu. 7-Eleven is also keiretsu in the meanwhile. So these companies have a lot of market power and they have a lot of emotional power as well in the market. And one thing is important that, and that's also a big misunderstanding, is that if you are dealing with this kind of companies, everything they want is basically an order. They're not very used to discussing a lot. They have so much power, like market power, and as I said, emotional power, that they usually listen to. So that's one important factor. It is good if you're cooperating or if you're connected to them. So if you have a business partner that's called Toyota, everything will work in Japan and everyone wants to do business with you, that's for sure. But at the same time, of course, it can be quite stressful to do business with these companies because their demands, as is seen in the case, are often really not very considerate of other person's needs. So basically, if they want to have a meeting, they will get a meeting. If they want to do a meeting on a weekend, they will get that too, and nobody will say no to them. Because there are some customers you can really not say no to. So we also have a certain ranking within companies. There are companies that are higher up or that have more market power. And this is actually a really important factor because outside Japan, it's not always the same. Customers are customers and the customers still have to abide by the rules or abide by contracts. But in Japan, some customers have priority. And this is actually one thing that can also lead to a lot of cross-cultural misunderstandings. For example, I've done a lot of work for a European firm who has a very big business in Japan. And one of their biggest customers is Sumitomo. And Sumitomo is one of the big conglomerates, and Sumitomo always gets a preferred treatment. Yeah, and the Europeans in the headquarters did not really understand why Sumitomo gets a preferred treatment, and that's really the business partner is Yeah, let me just finish the story and then I answer your question. And Sumitomo is one of the biggest companies in Japan, and they have to get a special treatment because, first of all, this is what you do in Japan, and the second thing is, if Sumitomo is your customers, you get so many more customers that it's actually worthwhile to take care of them in first, yeah. And this created a lot of issues because headquarters could not understand why, if Sumitomo made a mistake, it was forgiven, or if they would get special treatments like working on the weekend or something like that. But again, as I said, there are more important customers in Japan. And if you are dealing with one of the big K-debtors or the big conglomerates, then of course they always have to be, let's say, taken care of in a very special way. The business partner is usually treated the same way as an insider. If the company is integrated, for example, a startup goes to Japan, a startup has a really good technology and is bought or integrated by a big conglomerate, they are one of them. Yeah, so they get the same treatment as the company when somebody treats with them, somebody does business with them, but inside they do not get a preferred treatment. Yeah, so basically they are on the lower level because they're younger and they're not so long with the company, but from the outside they have become a member of this big firm and they basically can get every deal the big firm gets. So that's what I'm saying. Many foreign startups, especially younger or smaller companies, do team up with big conglomerates in Japan, and this is actually a very good way to do business there. Yeah, and sorry, another thing that is important is that these big Japanese companies have actually a long experience of integrating smaller firms into their groups. Yeah, they're not doing it like Chinese or Korean firms. They do not often change them very much. And on top of that, Japanese conglomerates are really big investors in startups. Yeah, this is also a big difference to other markets, because in some other markets, you have actually, for example, in Europe, the government would sponsor these companies, but in Japan, these companies are really sponsored by other firms. So I would like to continue now with my sharing. Wait a minute. So here we can see, okay, go on. So one of the most important concepts in Japan is the concept of Shikata. Shikata basically means process orientation. And that sounds very easy or very simple, but in fact, the Japanese success or Japanese business is based on process. Yeah. So what does this mean? In Japan, my professor, when I was in university, always used to say, in Japan there is a certain samurai attitude. Yeah, people go to battle. They may lose or win, but if they win and lose, they still go back, shape up again, and go to battle again. So there is a certain love and idea about doing things the proper way. And Shikata actually means doing things the proper way it should be done. So for example, you learn a process. Let's say if you go to a Japanese convenience store, people are very well trained to greet you. They are very well trained to tell you certain things, and they will always do it. Yeah. It doesn't matter what time of the day, it doesn't matter what happens, the process is always kept. And this is a very big Japanese competitive advantage. Processes in Japan always work. And this is really good and bad at the same time. So when Japanese companies started to restructure or basically revive again after the war, they started to manufacture. And if you manufacture products, the process is really important. Of course, everybody wants a car that is manufactured perfectly and that does not have any mistakes or any defects. And when Japanese companies did that, they became better and better in manufacturing over the years, so they could produce cheaper and cheaper with high quality, and that actually brought a lot of money to Japan. So process orientation is really a very important issue in Japan, because this is the reason why Japan is such a successful and rich country, and we can really call it the backbone of Japanese success. So many Japanese companies are really good in process, and they're really, really favoring processes over anything else. And when we look at two major aspects in business, for example, production, sorry, manufacturing, and service, Japanese companies are usually leading. Yeah, so this is really relevant. It can be a bit problematic, but I'll talk about this in a minute. So why is this so important? Japanese companies started to produce, as I just said, and they became extremely successful in this. Yeah, so Japanese manufacturing is called monotsukuri, basically means producing things. And the most famous concept here is called just in time. Just in time was developed by Toyota, and just in time is now an international standard. So it's used all over the world and has actually revolutionized, especially car manufacturing. What happens here, this is a very unique system. You can see this. There is a belt, the cars move on the belt, and people here who are assembling are just standing there. They don't go anywhere, and all the car parts are brought at the very exact minute to this person to make sure that they can be assembled correctly. And while they're assembling it, they're also taking care of, of the quality at the same time. So Japan is the world leader in production. So it's the most effective producer of products in the world, which means they can produce products with the highest quality at the lowest cost. And the Japanese are always beating their own records, because this is really a very important factor. If you ever go to Japan and you have the time, it's really advisable to go to Nagoya and have a look at the Toyota factories. The tours there is really, really fascinating how well organized this is. Yeah. So this kind of Japanese management practice is a worldwide standard and has really changed manufacturing all over the world, and is very much based on the Japanese idea of performing any kind of process perfectly. Yeah. So again, process orientation is key and cannot be avoided. So one thing is really important to know here: any kind of improvisation and is not really welcome. Processes are often also more important than strategy. The reason here is that, of course, every process, like most other things in Japan, is developed by a group, so not only by one person, and must be done correctly, exactly as it's lined out. For example, in my school, we have an event every semester before the students get to study. It's called the orientation camp. It's a 1.5 day outing with the students. We take the students to a place near Mount Fuji, and we have a group of students who is actually managing this, and they have a manual for every minute or 5 minutes of this whole 1.5 days. The manual is about 20 pages long, and it's so detailed that sometimes when I was in charge of organizing this camp with the students, I found this really too difficult to deal with. But the students really liked it, and they basically would work out every little step of the manual very carefully. And that's exactly how it goes. There's a lot of plans, there's a lot of layouting plans, sometimes really by the minute. Yeah. And this is, of course, one strength of Japanese companies, but it's a weakness at the same time, because when you are dealing with very strong process orientation, you have the expectation everyone else is working like this too. And I think in Japan, we can find the strongest process orientation in the world. So Japanese companies who are really very, very, very detailed in what they plan and what they do, they also expect foreign business partners to do the same. Yeah, which is sometimes a bit of problem. Sorry, because foreign companies say, okay, let's do it, let's meet here and then see. This is not really how it goes in Japan. Everything is really planned out very carefully. The problem with process orientation in Japan is that it's not really good in times of crisis. So there's a lot of examples when people are actually suddenly facing some change or big problem, and it's very difficult to handle that. One reason is that, of course, everything is planned out so carefully that any kind of problem is not really kind of expected to happen. That's one thing. And the second thing is that we also have, of course, any change of process can only be done by everyone. Yeah, so it's not possible to say, oh, hey, great, I have this great idea, let's do it different today. Yeah, that's not really a good idea in Japan. So whatever happens is you have to go back to the group and you have to tell everyone and you have to decide together to make a change. Yeah, and that again takes time. So this comes back to what I said before. You're discussing with somebody in the group and you're discussing with somebody, you think this person is actually allowed to make a change or to decide something that's not happening. I had a student once, an American student in my class in Tokyo, and when we discussed this in class, he said that he has a job in a Japanese restaurant. And one time, one of the chefs in a restaurant decided to put some kitchen towel somewhere else, maybe 2 meters in a different place, 2 meters away from the original place. And they had to have a meeting with the other chefs and all the other members in the group to say, okay, from now on, the kitchen towels will be a little bit further down the table. And it took 10 minutes and everyone was informed about this change and then they could continue work. And my American student was very surprised about that because he said in the US people would just put it somewhere else and then let everyone find it. But even these small differences in Japan or changes in Japan are really important and must be discussed with them. So this means that emergency or improvisations are a problem, yeah, and really irritating people. So it means that for you as a foreigner doing business in Japan, plans have to be made very carefully for every detail, even details that you would find so important. For example, who sits where, or what time do we go to the restaurant, what exactly do we eat at a restaurant. So everything is really, really relevant and is something that you need to take care of. Yeah, so many details are planned out that you wouldn't really think of, but that's really important for a Japanese business partner. And a strong process orientation also shows the Japanese business partner that you're serious about doing business and that you can actually understand them. Yeah, so if processes are demanded, it's a good idea to just say yes and do it. Yeah. So here we see it, every process is planned out really very carefully, as I just said. And one thing is important too, many aspects in Japan, especially if you do imports, if you deal with official authorities or something like this, are extremely bureaucratic. However, it really works. Yeah, so that's really a big difference for somebody like me who is from Europe. When people in a European office, governmental office, tell you we are done next week, they may be done or they're not done. But in Japan, if they tell you you get the papers on Monday at 10 a.m., you will get them. So I've always really found Japanese business processes or the bureaucratic processes a little bit tiresome. But one thing I have to say, I've never in 30 years had the experience where something was delayed or didn't work. So if people tell you it works, it does work. And that's very reliable too. And that's, of course, also one thing that you have to communicate to your Japanese business partner, that you are reliable. If you tell people this is going to happen, this must be happening. And this is, of course, a really important factor here. One aspect is that inside the group, as we said, we have a really strong group. We have a very family-like group in the company. We want to make sure that we can stay together for a very long time. And this is very important for Japanese companies, that people stay. Yeah. So stability is one of the main factors. And stability in all relationships is strongly wished for. So the company is really trying to avoid open conflict, especially inside the firm, but also outside. Yeah, it doesn't mean there are no lawsuits or there are no conflicts, but it means that there is always the idea of trying to get along and trying to have a relationship that helps avoid conflict, or basically helps to communicate with each other very openly. In fact, what I have experienced in Japan in the past 30 years is that Japanese companies or Japanese business partners really try to have a relationship in which the communication can always continue. It doesn't mean that people cannot have conflicting opinions. They can also have open conflicts, but it is still important to have a relationship in which you can continue your communication and your interaction with everybody. So this means that you are more expected to take a step back, or if the conflict is actually really very strong, sorry, you bring somebody in who helps and interferes and who is actually trying to make sure the interaction goes smoothly with everyone. And as I said, it's also a really important factor to make sure that the way you talk to each other is on a certain level. So losing your temper or screaming at people or something like this is not really something that you can see in an Asian or in an East Asian Japanese office very often. People are supposed to be professionals and behave accordingly. Yeah. So trying to be open-minded and trying to make sure that the relationship can always continue is a major factor, even if the business interaction doesn't go the way it is. I told you about the example of Lipotype before. They had similar experiences. They had some issues with their business partners, and they brought in some mediators and continued the relationship, and then it worked out really well. So that would be a classic way to go. Here is a video that I will not show you now because it's about 10 minutes. If you have time, you can watch this on your own afterwards. This video is about giving presents in Japan. Giving presents is, of course, one way to keep harmony and to make sure that the interaction with business partners works really well. And of course, in Japan in general, there is a lot of presents giving, like in most Asian countries. And like in most Asian countries, it's food presents, and that's really an important aspect. And it is important also to give presents to a group, again, not to an individual. So here we have two more aspects. Decision making, as I said, in Japan is usually a group process. This can be different if the company CEO is the owner. So we have a few companies in Japan, very big ones too, who are actually led or who are managed by the CEO. There are some famous examples that you know. Probably Uniqlo is led by Mr. Yanai, who is also the son of the founder. Then we have Rakuten. Rakuten is managed by Mr. Mikitani, who also founded the company. Or, for example, SoftBank, who is also managed by Mr. Son, who, or not anymore, but mostly related to him. And the difference between these companies and classic Japanese companies is that there is one person who can make a decision, and that, of course, makes things very fast. But if you are doing business with Japanese companies, don't be surprised that if you're not talking to the CEO, that decision making is always, and I'm saying this again, always a group thing. Yeah. So one really important thing to remember, and I can't say this often enough, is if you meet somebody who has a certain position, let's say a general manager or project manager or whatever, this person usually is not having the same power as you if you have a similar position. Yeah. So basically, every time this person has to go back to the group and ask for approval or ask the group to support the decision making. And here we can see some tools that are used in Japan. Basically, the one on the right side, we can see Nemawashi. Sorry, that's a spelling mistake. But what it means is that we are laying the foundation for something. Nemawashi is a very simple process, but it's extremely time consuming. So let's say I have a new idea in a company. I cannot just say and raise my hand and say, hey, I want to do this. Yeah, let's do it together. The thing is that I would have to go around the office, or I would have to go around to all my business partners and have a cup of tea and have a chat and basically say, hey, I have this idea. What do you think of it? I get feedback. I modify the idea. And after 2 weeks or so, I have talked to everybody who is concerned, and everyone has given me his or her ideas. And then I present it in a meeting, for example, but everybody already knows what's going on. Yeah, this is the reason why sometimes the Japanese meetings, there are votes for some ideas, and everyone says yes, and that looks always like Japanese people always say yes, but that's not really the truth. In fact, everything has been discussed already before, and people know already what they want to say, and people have made up their minds already, and the decision has been made by everyone together, and this is just the finalizing the decision. Yeah. So nemawashi is something you cannot avoid, and I can really tell you it's very, very difficult. Well, I have never managed in 30 years once to just come up with something and people would talk to me about it. So basically it means that if you have a new idea, if you want to change something, you have to take your time and talking to people, often in a private setting or over dinner or a beer or whatever, and make sure they can warm up to the idea and that you can actually get a yes later. Yeah, nemawashi is also a good place to get feedback. So you have an idea and people will say, oh yeah, maybe you should do it like this, or maybe this will not work, or maybe you could try again doing something else. And that is the best way to getting a yes. Yeah, but you will hardly, well, I have never experienced that you can just come up in a meeting saying, let's do that, and people will actually start discussing this idea right away. So that's not really how it works. So, and the other concept that is really important here is the so-called Linguist System. The Linguist System is a similar thing. It's a little bit more formal. Basically, what it means is that you are involving everyone in a decision in a written way. Yeah. So what usually happens is that you have a document, you send a document to up to 50 people, even more. Everyone reads the document and everyone can change it, or everyone can give comments on it. So after 2 weeks or so, you have a final document that everyone has seen and everyone has read and everyone has actually modified if necessary. And after this, everyone stamps the document. Yeah. So this is actually a really important thing, because what it means is that everyone is informed, so nobody's left out. Even you can really put a lot of people in. So the ranges I usually get are for 38 people or for 50 people even. And nowadays, this is often done via a shared document online or something. You can just basically change or give comments. But traditionally, it was actually done in a printed form, and people could write whatever they thought was right or wrong right there. And in the end, everyone would stamp. So what does this mean? It basically means, as I said, everyone's informed, everyone can say something, everyone is included in the process. So this is actually a bottom-up decision-making tool where the whole company can be asked. And of course, very important is also that nobody is responsible if something goes wrong. Yeah, that's actually a really important factor. And that's also one reason why, if there is a problem, yeah, people are not blaming one person, because they've all made the decision and they've actually discussed it really a long time before the decision was made. Yeah, so Japanese decision-making tools are very democratic. Yeah, of course, emotional power plays a role. They're not 100% democratic in a sense that everyone is exactly the same. Some people, of course, have more to say. But one thing we can really say, it is including very many aspects of a problem, and it really means that you ask everybody about his or her opinion. So what this means for companies is, once the decision is made like this, there is very little resistance afterwards. Yeah. So decisions can be implemented really quickly in Japan. So even once it's made, like the next day, it's sometimes even done. But the decision-making process as such takes a lot longer than in any other country, because there's too many people to ask. Yeah, this is also a problem when we have a crisis. Yeah, so when there's a big crisis in Japanese management, it often takes too long to come up with a decision, because in many cases there is no individual decision maker. And there is also a big discussion whether this is the best way to do it, because we can see that owner-managed firms like, as I said, yeah, Uniqlo or Rakuten are much faster in their decision-making, yeah, because they have usually one person, at least at the top, who can say yes or no. Yeah, but this is something, sorry, you have to keep in mind that if you ask for an answer for a question, or if you ask for a decision in Japan, it will not be as fast as in your country. It will definitely take a lot longer, up to a few days, sometimes even more. Yeah. So what does this mean for us? Yeah, if you have a negative message or a no, it shouldn't be communicated like too directly. I mean, in Japan, people are very good at taking hints if something takes longer. And one thing is also important, that you will not really get a no. Yeah. One classic way of saying no in Japan is the word maybe, yeah, which can be quite confusing because in some languages maybe means I tell you later, but maybe usually means no. Yeah. So this is really important to clarify whether things are happening or not. So basically, all kinds of communication is a lot more vague and softer than in other cultures. And that's also a little bit confusing for some people because they don't always understand what's going on. One way to deal with that is maybe ask, I always tell my clients to ask for percentages. So do we have more than 5% chance of getting this deal, or what are the chances in terms of percents of doing this? And that actually helps to get a more clear answer. Presents are usually given to all members of the group. It's a group present. And one thing that you can also see in the film, if you watch it later, is that private presents are not given to people in front of others. So private presents are usually given in private because that's a bit embarrassing for the person you are dealing with. One more thing is important here, that if you get a present, you do not open it in front of others. Yeah, that's really considered very rude. If somebody in a Japanese business setting gives you a present, then you just take it and take it back home and say thank you afterwards when the next meeting happens. But it's not a very good idea to open it in front of everybody. One more thing that is also leading to a lot of confusion with foreigners and Japanese business partners are apologies. If something goes wrong, a Japanese business partner usually expects an apology. In many countries, apologies are seen as a sign of guilt, and they can lead to legal problems. So there is often, especially with European business partners, the big problem of getting an apology, which many Western, especially Western companies, do not want to give because they are very afraid of getting into legal issues or being sued or something like this. But in Japan, saying sorry or apologizing, like in many other Asian countries, is actually a way of smoothening the communication and improving the relationship. It's not necessarily a sign of something is really my fault. Yeah, it basically just means I want to make sure that we can cooperate again. So the overall idea here is that we can continue our conversation and our communication and relationship after whatever happened. So here we have one more case that I would like to show you. Maybe you can have a short look at that. Let me see. Here we are. This is the wrong one. Yeah. So I'm not sure if you can see it. Let me see. I can show this to you. Let's see. So maybe you can have a short look at this case for 2 minutes. And this is a very typical thing. It's a foreigner in Japan who thinks he is a really good boss. People can talk to him. And he realizes that his team is not really very critical of sharing critique. And the question is, of course, what can you do about that? How can you get more direct feedback that he really needs? Right. So maybe you can have a look at this for the next 2 minutes and then write the answers in the chat. So the question would be, what can you do about this, or which solutions can you develop? So the question would be, oh here, David will away something that's really yeah, thank you for your question, David. Yes, I think a startup proposal can be passed around as a Vindicator. I'm not sure if there would be too many corrections to it, but it definitely would be passed around to a lot of people. Yeah. So this is really one thing you always have to keep in mind. If 20 or 30 people see what you're doing in Japan, that's not really unusual. Yeah. So the proposal has to really be very sound, and also it will actually, I mean, you can expect that people make comments on that, and that they will actually correct it or improve it or have more community-oriented ideas about that. Yeah, and as for the case, basically you could find an assistant. Yes, what people usually do in a case like this is that they, as I said, they basically put or they let the group decide instead of asking people directly. So unless the relationship with people in Japan is really very good, people don't want to be picked out and asked, what do you think? Yeah, that's one thing I also had to learn when living and teaching in Japan. But it's a good idea to give a task to 2 or 3 people together, and then they come up with a solution as a group. So nobody is actually kind of standing out and saying something, but they present it as a group and as a result of the group. And that's really the best way to go. Instead of saying, let's have an open discussion here, I place the question, or I give the question to you before the meeting, 2 days before that, and then you present solutions or ideas in groups. One other thing that is really quite popular that I do a lot is so-called brainwriting. Brainwriting is a version of brainstorming, and brainstorming basically means that everyone is just in a group saying, I think this, and afterwards we look at all these ideas, which is, as I said, not really so popular in Japan. But what usually I do, and that works pretty well, is I give people post-its with the same color, and people just write ideas on these post-its without their names, and then all the ideas are put up on a wall or on a whiteboard or flip chart, whatever, and then the ideas are discussed without connecting them to a person. Yeah, so basically the idea is the focus, and nobody knows who had these ideas, and nobody thinks needs to defend the idea. I know that this kind of issues sound a bit odd. Sorry. When we talk about decision making in most cultures, people want to be connected to ideas. They want to be responsible. They want to say, hey, it's my idea. I want to get the credit for that. But in Japan, this is often the opposite. Yeah, people feel more motivated by doing things in a group. They also feel more related to the topic if they do it together. And that's really a very important factor. Yeah, because one reason and one thing that you always have to remember, especially in bigger Japanese firms, people are not promoted because they are having the best ideas or because the best strategies. They are promoted because they're good group members. Yeah, and that's of course one thing you can show here really well. So I will just continue. Let me see if I can show this again. So here we go. And I have a few more things that I would like to say. Basically, the next thing is, and that comes not really as a surprise for most of you, I guess, is that there is a certain idea about how work is done. One way to do it is, as I said, always according to the rules, trying to keep everyone in the right place, doing things together, changing processes together, but also doing things as good as possible. Yeah, so there's a certain perfectionism that is really important in Japan. We can see this, for example, if people in Japan are doing handicrafts or traditional crafts, for example, creating, I don't know, ceramics or something like this, or also arts. Yeah, the idea of learning this is a long-term process, sometimes 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, and becoming better and better and becoming really a perfectionist is really very important. Yeah, we can see this attitude also in the companies. The idea is that if you stay long enough in a company, if you do this for a long time, you get better and better at it. This is also, of course, relating to the idea that older members or experienced members have more power they have more ideas, they know the business better. But at the same time, there is really, and I think this is also very special in Japan, this attitude that you need time to learn something and you need to learn it on your own. Yeah. One thing that is also very important, that's not really our main topic here today, is the idea of experience-based learning in Japan. Japanese companies and Japanese managers really prefer to learn things by doing them. Yeah. So people will actually bring a lot of others to any meeting. You will hardly meet, or probably never meet, a person alone. There will always be younger people watching. There will be younger people learning. And the idea is not to learn things by the book and then use them, but the idea is to learn them by doing them with others, especially with olders. And this content comes on top of that. So the longer you do something, the better you get, the more experience you have, and the more perfect the process becomes. So what does this mean for you? The performance expectations in Japan are always really high. So there is this expectation everyone is doing as good as they can. And the excuses of saying, look, I'm tired, or I have to take care of my family is not really, these are not very acceptable excuses. So the idea is always that if you work, you should work as good as you can under any condition. Yeah. So the expectation towards perfectionism is really also an expectation we have towards our business partners. We really want to make sure our business partners are doing a really good job, and especially at the beginning of the process and the interaction with businesses overseas. These businesses are really scrutinized very carefully. Do they react quickly? Do they answer right? And whatever they do is really taken care of. And you need to kind of make sure that people feel comfortable with you right from the beginning. So one way to show that is that you answer an email right away. Yeah, Japanese business partners find it very irritating if they have somebody that wants to do business with them and then they take 2 days to answer an email. Yeah, that's really, really not a good idea. Not that they don't do it themselves. They often do it themselves, but they still expect, since they're the client, to have really good answers. So one way to do that is, even if you can't answer right away, is to say, thank you for your email. I will answer by tomorrow, 8 a.m. or something like that. And that should happen then. So just to make sure that you always give people a feeling that the process is taken care of, that everything is taken care of, and that you really find it very important what's going on. As I said, correct mistakes happen, and mistakes must be explained and corrected. There are different levels. I mean, sometimes there are really serious mistakes, let's say in production, that have an effect on a lot of products. And in this case, usually what happens is there's a written explanation, there's a written apology, there's also personal apology. So there are some kind of rituals that you have to take care of. But in general, excuse me, it is really very important that if there is anything happening, any kind of misunderstanding, that there is an apology. Yeah. So as I said before, this apology doesn't always mean that you're guilty or that you've done something on purpose, but it basically says, look, I really want to continue this relationship with you. I'm very, very concerned about anything that happens here, and that's really relevant. Yeah. One thing here is to make sure the processes go well, is that Japanese business partners ask very many questions. And very many questions means really very many questions. This could be questions about the history of the company, it could be questions about other products, about the prices of products in other markets. Sometimes from a foreign company's perspective, completely unrelated questions. And still, these questions must be answered properly, because you want to show I'm a valuable business partner. I'm really interested in doing business with you, and I share as much information as possible. So this is really one aspect that many foreign business partners are very often a little bit annoyed about, because they think, okay, why do you ask me about my business in, I don't know, in Africa if we're doing business in Japan? But the idea here again is I want to know as much as possible about my business partner, and I want to make sure I'm making the right choice in doing business with that, because the risk perception is really very high. One more thing that is important here is that of course the history of the company that business is done with is better. So if you're in a company that isn't a total startup and you have a longer history and you have members that are really good to show around, then please do that. Yeah. So the background of the firm is really something that should be presented very open. That's Oh, then there are two more concepts that are really very important. The first one is Gambado. And Gambado basically means I am overcoming difficulties. I am not being stopped by any kind of trouble that I meet during my journey or whatever. The Gambado attitude is also a very classic Japanese attitude, and it's really a very important thing to think of. Giving things up or stopping things in the middle of, I don't know, a process is a very bad thing to do in Japan. So people are actually really trying to motivate each other to finish things, even if it's difficult, and come to an end. I think from a Japanese point of view, it's not such an important thing to come to an end. For me as a European, I always find this really important because things get done with this attitude. Yeah. And in Europe, for example, it's much more accepted to say, oh, I don't feel like this anymore, I've changed my mind or something like this. Whereas in Japan, once a process started, a process needs to be done properly, it needs to be done the best possible way, and it needs to finish at some point. So you have to kind of do it until the end. So this is a very, very positive thing, and people who work very hard and people who are really trying to do their best are perceived as very good people in Japan. The second aspect here is a more passive concept. It's called gaman. Gaman is translated as patience, tolerance, endurance. But what it means is that you are not getting too upset about things that you cannot really change. Yeah, a classic example would be a Japanese train where there's like double as many people as should be in there, and it's hot, and you can't sit, and you have to go another 2 hours on this train. And instead of getting upset, or you just close your eyes and you think, okay, it's going to be fine. And I try to relax internally to make sure that I don't waste too much energy on being upset here. And these two concepts sound maybe very Japanese, and they're often seen as one major reason why Japan became so successful after the war, because people had a really very certain attitude, and they really wanted to succeed, so they could overcome a lot of difficulties with these ideas. What does this mean? It means persistence is a virtue. Yeah, so being persistent in your attempts to do business with Japanese companies is a really good thing. Persistence should be done in a non-aggressive way, like asking things again and again is also possible for you. Yeah, but of course not in a condescending or in a kind of pushy way. Basically just doing things again and again. That's often seen as a very positive thing in Japan, that you people really don't give up and continue trying to work on something. You have a lot of business stories in Japan where people really try to do things for very many years and are very persistent. And for example, developing something at home, a new product or new flavor or whatever, for years and years and years. So these kind of things are seen as a very positive thing in Japanese society. It also means that you need to show a lot of patience when doing business in Japan, because things do take time. Yeah. I have the impression that processes take at least double as long as in other countries, so you need to plan this in. However, as I said before, once the process or the business relationship is established, it's really very reliable, and it's expected to last for very many years. And this is something that, of course, is really very, very valuable for many firms, especially smaller companies. So having a good Japanese business partner is really a very, very strong boost for any business. But the investment, the emotional investment, the time investment on top of any other investment is really probably a lot higher than in other markets. That's what I say. Usually Japanese business partners are in a stronger positions, especially the bigger companies. So they are often not in a hurry to do things quickly. They can wait. There are exceptions, of course. Sometimes people really have technology or product that Japanese companies want to have. In that case, it can go really quickly. But in general, this is really something you need to know and you need to plan in. So as I said before, you have to kind of consider that this is going, or you have to kind of make sure that this is going longer, and you have to. And the most important thing is always that Japanese business partners do not want to take any risk when doing business in Japan, because they cannot easily go back. Yeah, and it's very important for them to make sure that they have a business partner that is reliable, that they can have a long-lasting relationship, and of course that they don't go into relationships that fail or that create a lot of trouble internally. Yeah, nobody wants to take that risk. And if you kind of communicate that you're not reliable in whatever way, then business will definitely not happen. Yeah. So communicating a trustworthy relationship, or trying to be really the best possible partner these companies can have, is really important, and to make sure that you can create a certain relaxedness from the Japanese. So here we have another example, a final example for the company called Nixus, also a Singaporean company, which is working in diagnosis or any kind of diagnosis related to medical conditions of people. And they, of course, entered the market at a very good time when PCR testing became a big issue in Japan, and they could offer that very quickly too. But their main product is some processes that try to help to identify cancer quickly. And in the beginning, of course, they were trying to enter the market very quickly. But one thing they had a really good technology that's very needed in Japan, and that really helped. Yeah, so they could convince partners very quickly and are now very successful in Japan. I'm now at the end of my presentation. I have actually added my ebook about Japanese business concepts to the folder where you can download all the materials from. You can also download this presentation. And I would be very happy that if you have a look at this. In this book, we have actually summarized the most important aspects of Japanese management, and we explain them. And I think it's a very interesting and enjoyable read to learn more about this. And here is the QR code for your local pitch, and I hope that you will use it. So I'm finished now, and I'm ready for questions. And if there are any questions, then maybe you can just ask them right now, and or put them in your chat, so we can go from here. I thought that David wrote something already. Yeah, apologies are a really big problem. Yeah, and there have been a lot of stories about that, where companies could not apologize and lost a lot of money because of this. But in Japan, as I said, apology is a lot more formal and not really a legal aspect. Yeah. And then, of course, yeah, the startup doesn't have a history, but the founders do, yes. And if people, for example, have experience in having founded companies before, that's definitely worth mentioning. Yeah, that's very true. Good, thank you very much. Yeah, if there are any questions, then please ask me now, and I'm very happy to answer. Yes, Edward has a question.
Hello, Professor. I have a question. We are a startup and we are preparing to going to launch a business in Japan, but we are thinking about how to do the local hiring, because based on my understanding, Japanese, they are not easy and might refuse to work for foreigners. So how would you suggest us?
Okay,
thank you.
So the first question is, do you need any specialized people, or do you basically just need company staff who is bilingual? Or
basically we'll start from company staff.
Yes, so there's many ways to go. I mean, of course, you can just post ads in these classic homepages. That's where people would usually look. Yeah. If you want to find bilingual stuff, there are specialized homepages for people who speak English and Japanese. It's probably easier to find people who are not, let's say, chemists or engineers who are bilingual. That's actually really difficult. Yeah. But one thing you can do is also go to universities directly and try to talk to people there. What we do at, for example, at my university, where most of the students are fully bilingual and they want to have jobs like this, is that companies offer internships to the students and then they start working with them and hire them later. So for classic office stuff, this is the best. You need to go through various channels. One thing that does not work so really well is social media. For some reason, Japanese do not really apply so much via LinkedIn or Instagram or something like that. You can still try that. So that's really important for giving the company a local idea, or basically show the company is existing in Japan and giving people an idea what the company is about. But I would go for all the online channels. I would also go, there is a work agency in Japan. It's called Hello Work. Yeah, this is actually an agency that provides jobs. And this is also the place where you can actually advertise a lot of jobs, like classic office jobs, very easily. But if you want really bilingual stuff, one thing I would try to do also is to go and access universities and try to get contact with more students, and then hire from there, which is actually one thing that many companies, foreign companies, do. It is much more challenging to hire people who have a specialized background. So if you want to have, let's say, as I said before, a chemist or an engineer who is bilingual, it is much more difficult. The problem is that, as I said before, these people, when they work for very big, famous Japanese companies, they are not very easily leaving these firms. Yeah, and that's not only a problem for startups, that's also a problem for big names. For example, if you work for BMW or Audi, that's in Japan not as good as working for Toyota. Yeah, so even the big players, in foreign players in Japan, have problems hiring people. But then again, you know, it always depends on who you talk to. And it also depends on what you're offering. Yeah, in Japan, not very many people change jobs, but there is more and more people changing jobs. And one reason is, of course, that these big conglomerates have very strict and rigid work environments. Often the payment is often also not so good. So there might be other ways that you can attract people with. Yeah. But if you just want bilingual staff members, this is easier, and it's becoming a lot more attractive now for people to work for startups, yeah, and for foreign companies. And that is really something you can deal with. Yeah. If you like, I can also connect you to a number of internship programs in Japan. There are some homepages where you can actually connect with younger people or students, and that really works well. We also have, for example, at my university, we have really not hundreds, but we have every year at least 5 to 10 students who are fully bilingual in Chinese, in English, and Japanese at the same time. So these are usually students that start working in companies that do business with other Asian countries, and they get hired after a while directly out of school. So that would be one way to go. Yeah.
I see. Thank you.
Hope this answered your question. Any more questions? Yeah, I mean, maybe one more thing about hiring. Yeah, this is pretty much the biggest challenge, I would say. But then again, it is possible. Yeah, I think it gets more complicated, as I said, if you really want a very specialized person. Yeah, and then of course you can also hire a foreigner in Japan. That is a lot easier. Yeah, and there is an increasing number of foreigners living in Japan, speaking Japanese really well, and they are very interested usually in working for startups too. That's also an option. Good, thank you very much. Any more questions? Maybe one more thing about the connection with startups, with companies in Japan. I know it sounds a little bit odd that startups in Japan basically connect with big conglomerates, but one thing you might want to look into is that many of these big companies like Dentsu or Marubeni or Mitsubishi, they have actually very special programs for startups. And these kind of programs can be quite diverse. For example, like free housing for a year or two, or they don't always buy the startups, but they provide any kind of conditions, or they provide support in various ways, financial support and so on. In most cases in Japan, these big companies are actually taking over the role of government or venture funds in other countries. Yeah. So it's not. It might sound a bit odd to work with such a big company if you're a startup in Japan, but it is really very beneficial. Yeah, and if there's different ways to do that. Japan has a very high rate of corporate venturing. Corporate venturing basically means that companies support ventures instead of venture capital firms. Yeah. And you mustn't forget that Japan is a market in which is a highly saturated market. So Japanese companies have a lot of money, and one way to grow is to buy other companies, but there's not so many companies they can buy anymore in Japan. Yeah, so they are very interested in buying businesses, and they have a lot of money to do that. And of course, not every startup wants to be bought or invested in fully, but in Japan, this is something you may consider because it's a bit different there. You need a big partner. The minute you have a really strong partner, business is so much easier because everyone will trust you and everyone will want to do business with you. Another option is to have one client that is very famous or well known, and then really promote the relationship with this client and tell people that you're working with this client, which makes everyone else trust you too. Yeah, doing it all on your own is really very difficult. Yeah. And the other option is, of course, that you are growing the business and just getting capital from people or being funded by people. There's a very famous German startup, which is actually a bit unique. It's a restaurant chain. It's called Schmatz. It's a kind of franchise system for German food. And this was founded by two really young men in Japan, actually. It was not founded in Germany, brought to Japan. And they found a lot of investors, very big chains in Japan, who invested in the concept, but they still are running the business on their own. So these kind of relationships are really very important. And one thing that is important to remember is that shouldn't be too much reluctance to interact with really big players as a startup from the beginning, because that's the best way to do it in Japan. It might not be the best way to do it in other markets, but in Japan it can be highly beneficial. Yeah. Yeah, that's really a very important thing to remember. Maybe a bit unique in Japan.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the presentation.
Yes,
I'm wondering, we have startups coming to Japan, and their size is very small. How can they even get respect in Japan because they are so small? How do they?
I think these things have really changed in Japan. Like 5 years ago, I would have said size is a problem, but now Japanese companies know they need innovation. Yeah, and in Japan, the startup scene is there, it's growing, yeah, but it is not growing fast enough. And there's a very clear idea of there must be something coming from outside. And technology, especially new ideas, are often very easily integrated in Japan. So I think the size is not always the point. It is much more important to have, let's say, a good technology, a good idea, something that Japanese people cannot do themselves, and then come in. So I think the timing now is really good. I wouldn't focus too much on the size, yeah. But one thing is important is that, of course, if you're really very small, you should have a clear idea on how to grow and how to do this in Japan. That's important too. Yeah, but I think Japanese companies at the moment are not so scared anymore of cooperating with a small partner, which really is new. Yeah, that's really something that you all have to remember. 5 years ago, this would have been a bit different. But the idea again is that the competition is so tough. We need new ideas, we need new partners. And again, Japanese companies have a really long tradition in integrating others. A Japanese conglomerate is a number of often hundreds of companies that are kind of connected via a financial institution. And these companies are, as I said, really rich in some cases, and they can only grow by integrating new companies. Yeah, and they have really understood that many of the new technologies they cannot develop by themselves, and their own companies cannot develop. I can give an example. Let's say we're talking about a big advertising company that has like decades of experience in doing international advertising or any kind of TV, whatever. And Japan has the biggest advertising companies in the world. But then let's say there's a new topic, for example, social media or mobile marketing, whatever, and the established managers in these companies cannot do it. That's a very common scenario lately, and they know they cannot do it, but they still need this new technology to keep going as a company. And they also know that they cannot give too much power to younger members in a company, because that would actually deconstruct the whole company. Yeah, if suddenly the younger people, like 2-3 years in a company, become department heads, that's not how it works. Yeah. So what they usually do is they basically make a new company with the younger people or the younger technology and let them develop their own system. So that's a classic way of growing a Japanese company. But it also means that I can buy a small younger company and integrate it very easily. So Japanese companies have a long history and experience in this, and that shouldn't be a problem. Yeah. But what is important is really that you have something that they want, and of course a certain competitive advantage. Yeah. The size as such wouldn't be such an issue anymore. Yeah, so that's really relevant. And as I said before, I wouldn't say that in any other countries, because in many other markets, let's say in the US or in China, you can grow very quickly on your own, very fast if you have a good product. Yeah. In Japan, you can grow faster with a good partner. And if the partner is big and strong, even more. Yeah, so that's really a big thing to remember. Yeah. And I would say that's a particularity of the Japanese market.
Thank you so much. I just had a follow-up question.
Yes.
You mentioned recruiting interns into startups. Now, as a professor in Japan for many years, I guess you've got a good idea how young people who are coming out of university, how do they see their career? Why is a startup an attractive environment for them, or are they still looking to be in a safe, larger company?
Well, I mean, basically, this is a really good question. 10 years ago, I would have said that everyone prefers to work at Toshiba instead of a startup, and that was really the case. Now it's really changed. First of all, it's becoming very popular to work at startups, and then young people in Japan are not this kind of company soldiers anymore that their parents used to be. I mean, they have parents who work really hard. They've seen this. They have a high level of living. So Japan is a rich country, and usually young Japanese people grew up in a very affluent society. So they have developed into more, let's say, self-actualization oriented young people. And the thing is, and the latest numbers show that classically, people would enter a company and it didn't matter so much what company it was. They would just stay for as long as possible. And if the company was selling, I don't know, a product they didn't like, never mind. Yeah. Now this has changed. 30% of young people, or basically 30% of university graduates, change jobs within 3 years after graduation, which is the highest number ever. And this shows us that people are looking for jobs that they feel good about. Yeah, so they want to do things that they're concerned about. It's really important for young people nowadays to do something that has to do with values. For example, doing something that is improving society, has a sustainability idea or something like that. That's actually really very, very important. And of course, one thing that is also really important is community. Yeah, so people want to feel they are part of something, they can change something. And that's, of course, a big competitive advantage of a startup. Yeah, Japanese companies will train people for many years. There will be a lot of older people involved. It will be sometimes difficult to see why you're doing this. And this is where startups can come in. Yeah. So as long as you do not need an experienced engineer who has experience for 10 or 15 years in a certain field, it might be a really good idea to go for younger graduates and go into universities directly and try to find people from there. I can tell that many of my students are really interested in doing this kind of internships in startups. I had one student 2 years ago who actually organized this on his own. He connected with startups and got internship jobs, and many of the students stayed there, yeah, because they liked it so much, they got so into it, and the community was really strong, and it's really socially accepted now in Japan to work for a startup. Yeah, 5 years or 10 years ago, this would have been really a big problem. The parents of the students would not like that, but now it's actually pretty okay. And as I said, many of these startups are connected to really big players, so that's also a very good thing. So there shouldn't be too much worry about that. But one thing is clear, recruiting people is really challenging in Japan, not only for startups, it's challenging for everybody. Yeah, so that's a big issue. However, the more innovative you get here in recruiting people, the better it is, because Japanese companies still recruit a very classic way. Yeah. And that's not really working this well anymore. Yeah, so that's a big thing. But yes, it's an issue. Yeah, but it shouldn't be something to worry too much about.
Thank you.
So, any more questions? One more thing maybe that just comes to mind now. I mean, in Japan, of course, networking is always important in every country and in every society, but in Japan, networking is basically a lot more important than in any other places. And I think, sorry, in Japan, it's really a very customary thing to go out, to go to events and meet many people and exchange name cards or whatever, and just stay in connection and make people see you. That's a real social investment in Japan. And I would say this is something that really must be done. Yeah. Another thing that is important is that social media are not so popular, as I said, for recruiting. It's okay, but it's not as good, let's say, as popular in other countries. But what is important is a social media presence to show the company. The most important social media channels in Japan are Twitter and Instagram. So being on Twitter and Instagram might be something that is one way to get the word out, and at least people who are looking for jobs, people who want to connect to the company, have a place where they can see more what's going on. Yeah, so this might be something you want to look into as well. LinkedIn is growing in Japan and is becoming more of an information platform. It's not as popular as in other countries yet, but LinkedIn is highly aggressive in the market. But basically, I would say a Twitter presence and an Instagram presence is really vital, because that's what Japanese people at the moment would look at first. Yeah. And in fact, I have to say it's quite surprising how these channels developed, but they developed a lot better than any others. So Facebook is not so important, and others either, but this might be a really good idea. Yeah. Good. So
A further question. Could you return to your slide where you're talking about the approval process, the different ways to get decision making?
All right. Yeah. Here we go. Yes.
And could you share your slides again, please?
Yes. Sorry. Yes. Yes, got it.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So you were saying that the group can be very large. Can you talk a little more about the hierarchy of the group? That is, we have different people at different levels. For example, should I send my proposal to the most junior person who would then circulate in the organization, or should I aim to send to the most senior person?
Okay, so one thing is important is that it doesn't really matter who you send it to. As let's say you have a team of 10 people and there is only one young man who can speak English, and this person is always communicating with you. You can send all the information to him and then he will share. And he will usually, when he answers you, put everyone on CC. Yeah. So that's not escalating anything. It has only the meaning to make sure everyone is involved and everyone knows what he's writing. But it's important to know that this young man cannot make any decision. He's just a communicator. So it doesn't really matter whether you send it to him or send it to the whole group. It does, however, make a difference when you want a decision. Yeah, because in many Western organizations, for example, there's one person in charge. And for example, if David, you're in charge of making this decision and you're a bit slow, I can actually tell you saying, look, David, you have to do that. And you're responsible if this takes too long. That would work. In Japan, it's often more easy to get a result if you address the whole group, because somebody then has to react. Yeah, so that's actually a bit different. So it's always a good idea to send it to everybody. If you get a mail with 10 people in CC, it's also okay to return the mail to 10 people in CC. But don't be surprised that if you talk to one person, that this is not really the person who can do anything. Yeah. So if you talk to one person, unless this person is the company boss or really a very high level ranked manager, then you will definitely have to wait for answers, because this person is mainly a communicator. Yeah. But what is most important is that you shouldn't be stressed by people involving a lot of others. In many Western firms, this is a way of escalating things or showing something is wrong. I'm involving many more people. But in Japan, it's exactly the other way around. Yeah, it basically means everyone is informed and nothing else. Yeah. And this is something you can do on your own too. You can inform everyone to make sure that people are actually forced to talk about each other about a decision, and that might be the idea. Yeah. So the more people, the better, I would say. But if it's only one person and this person is supposed to be the person communicating with you, then you just talk to that person. But you have to be patient for the answers. So it's not going to happen.
I think, yeah, in my experience, this is a real challenge, particularly when you're on a short business trip.
Exactly.
In Japan, and you don't have a lot of time to meet many people. You have a meeting and you need to identify who you are talking to. Now, would you consider it rude in your experience to ask somebody, are you a decision maker?
No, don't do that. Basically, if you have a meeting in Japan and you go into the meeting room, you know exactly who is the one who has the highest, most power. And mostly even that person doesn't make a decision alone. Yeah. So this is not really something in Japan, people believe that, let's say, I can be cleverer than my neighbor, but I can never be cleverer than 10 people together. So that's the thinking. So you would really ask everybody to make sure that it's the best possible outcome. Yeah. And as I said, unless this person has very decisive power, and that's usually the owner, there will never be a decision made by one person alone. I've never seen this in 30 years. Yeah. But what you can do is you can identify the person who has the most internal power, and this person's opinion is more valued. Yeah. So that's really one thing you can do. Yeah. And say, okay, this is the guy who can actually change something. So I might talk to that person and influence that person than the person who speaks English or something like that. That's often a misunderstanding, that the people who speak English are usually not the ones who have any say. Yeah.
Yeah, just to build on that, we often we hear from companies going into Japan who meet an agent of some kind who has somehow set themselves up as a bridge between outside and inside. Would you recommend finding that kind of person, somebody not necessarily part of an organization, but somebody who can be a cultural communicator?
I mean, it's not so much about the cultural communicator. If you find somebody, let's say this person has worked in a company before, this person is a retired manager from this company, knows everybody, then it's working. Yeah, if it's just a foreigner who has connections, that I would not do. It should be a Japanese person, preferably an older Japanese man. Yeah. And because you need somebody who has an inside connection, and this is not easy to get unless you've been there. Yeah. And in many cases, these people who are retired from these companies use their connections to improve the business, yeah, to introduce people, and they must be listened to. Yeah. But and they have not maybe the power, but they can actually connect you to the people who have. Yeah. I can give you an example. I have one friend who used to work for a big trading company for very many years, and his kohai, so somebody who was younger in his team, worked there for 10 years. And this young man was actually the heir of one of the biggest Japanese machine industry businesses. And so basically he worked there for 10 years in a totally different field and then took over this massive firm as a CEO. And my friend, who is now 75 or 80 almost, who is still an advisor to the CEO, he sometimes does things for him, he introduces people, but he has direct access to the CEO. Yeah, because he used to be his senpai for very many years. And even though this guy is the CEO now, he cannot really say no to him. And these kind of people are good to meet, yeah, because you can actually then access circles that you couldn't access on your own. And if you find people who can do this well, and there are people who can do this well in Japan, there's a lot of in Japan, traditionally you would call these people amakudari. They came down from heaven. Yeah. So usually they are retired managers who continue work in connection with the firm in some way. Then this can be really, really very, very profitable. Yeah. But it's sometimes difficult to judge which is the right person. Yeah. So it might be a good idea to talk to people at JETRO or something like this to get introductions to the right people. And I have heard many stories where this worked really very well. Yeah, so getting some inside connection is always a good idea. Yeah, and if you cannot find anyone who gives you this connection or supports you in getting the connection, you have to work on it on your own, which is also possible, but of course it will take longer. Yeah, so that's a different way to go.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I just switched into Chinese. 大家有其他的问题吗？你也可以打字，还是你可以讲话。我们还有几个分钟。Teresa 老师在的，所以如果有问题的话，那是一个很好的时间，你可以提问一下。没有吗？好的，那最后一部分时间，我就要介绍一下，就是下一步。Teresa, can you show us your slide again? The last slide. The last slide, please.
Which one?
The last slide, please.
The decision-making slide.
The last slide, please, in your slide deck.
Sorry, guys. Okay. Sorry. Here we go. Yes.
那我看到在我们的会议，我们还有17个多人的，所以我就要介绍一下下一步。那现在呢，今天这是第一个 seminar， 我们还有5个 seminar， 所以我们希望你们都可以全部的可以参加。我们有星期3、星期5，还有下周1、3、5。那 seminar 的时间中，你可以申请下一步，就是我们的 local pitch。那如果你想申请的话，你可以用那个 QR code 扫描一下，然后你可以申请。那申请以后，我们的 Global Digital Module 的团队会收到你的公司的就是资料，就是介绍的。那如果我们觉得你有机会就是去日本开业的话，我们都会让你们来上我们的 local pitch， 就是9月23号。所以我们最喜欢就是我们 seminar 的时间中，你都可以想一下。然后如果你觉得对我真的很想去日本，就是发展我的公司，你都可以用那个 QR code 上面都可以参加。那每个 seminar 会有这个 QR code， 就是最后的页面，所以如果你没有用的话，下一次星期3你也可以参加了。那星期3是我们请另外的日本的老师，就是hon给老师，他会讲日本的消费制 Japanese consumer behavior， 这是很有意思。那我们要现在谢谢Parisa 老师今天的课程很有意思，就是我们可以理解到他自己的就是自己的想法，还有我们的日本的就是产业文化。Parisa, thank you so much for your presentation today and your sharing and answering so many questions. And we really hope that your voice will get better soon. And thank you for
Sorry for that.
Thank you for making the time and effort for us today. Really, gambatte. as you explained, this is a perfect example of gambaru that you've joined in the presentation today. So thank you very much.
Bye-bye. All the best to you from Austria. Bye-bye.
With that, we will close today's presentation. And if you have any further question, of course, please scan the QR code so you can sign up for the local pitch September 23rd. And we will see you on Wednesday, 2 p.m., same time, for our next seminar. Thank you so much. Goodbye. ありがとうございます。お疲れ様でした。